Thank you very much indeed. One of my son's classmates died by suicide at the age of 12 a few years ago. It was a profoundly shocking experience for all of us who knew him. I had known the child since he was in kindergarten, and I wrote an article about the experience that we collectively had in relation to this child, and was overwhelmed by the number of letters that I received from people, and realized that people are so frightened of this topic that they often tend to avoid it, to the point at which there are preventable deaths that are taking place, and to the point at which people who are dealing with the prospect or with the aftermath of losing a child to suicide often do so in a state of isolation that can be terrible for them and that vastly exacerbates the pain of the people who have survived that loss, a loss that often seems to be incomprehensible. And so I've been in a process of talking to families who have lost children, to families who are afraid of losing children, to survivors of attempts, to people who are suicidal, and to scientists, including some of the remarkable and inspiring people we've already heard from today, and trying to understand this phenomenon of adolescent suicide and youth suicide, which has been on the up and up. It's popular to say it's been on the up and up for the last decade or so. With some ups and downs, it's been on the up and up for much longer than that. And it has to do, I think, with a changing world and also with the changing experience of adolescence. So Schopenhauer argued that death is the ultimate goal of life. And I think there are many young people who find the prospect of death so alarming that instead of avoiding it, as most of us are inclined to do, they tend toward it instead, with a sense that by rushing toward it, they can alleviate the terror that it entails. I also think that we have a very narrow notion of what suicide is. When I began this work, I assumed that some people died by suicide and other people died for other reasons and through other means. But as I went along, I came to see that while there are people whose suicidal behavior is very acute, there are also people who engage in self-destructive behavior with little regard for its consequences, who are in various ways parasuicidal, and that to rule one death a deliberate overdose and another an accidental overdose is to draw distinctions that are much finer than they would appear to be. And so I found, as I talked to young people in particular, that often the question, why would you want to kill yourself, was met with an equal question, why wouldn't you want to kill yourself? And as someone who myself had been depressed when I was younger, I thought, why didn't I kill myself, and why do some other people? So insofar as anything I'm going to say fits with the theme of hope over the horizon, it's because in studying suicide, one is inevitably also studying the things that keep us going and the reasons why people stay alive. Now, the statistic that was often presented to me as though it were going to be comforting in some way is that 2/3 of the time, younger people who die by suicide have had previous episodes of extreme depression, evidence of mental illness, experiences of trauma, and other obvious external factors that point them toward this sort of death. But that leaves more or less 1/3 of the young people who die by suicide in whom there has been almost nothing that seemed, or indeed nothing at all, that seemed to point toward it, or at least nothing that seems to have been detected by their families or by science so far. And as the father of teenagers, I found the idea that children who seem entirely well-adjusted, a category that does not always include my own children, might in fact die by suicide in this abrupt way. I found it utterly terrifying. And so I set out to try to understand what many of the factors were that seemed to be predictive. And one of the first things that I found was the intense correlation between suicide and bullying, which I had always assumed would be the case. What I had not recognized is that the bullies are as much in jeopardy as the subjects of bullying. And if you stop and think about it, bullies are not usually terribly happy people, with the exception of some involved in the current American political spectrum. But by and large, people who are bullies are themselves suffering enormously. And there is a tendency not to recognize their pain and anguish because they are causing other people pain and anguish. And that's very, very distracting. So I'm going to describe to you a few of the people I've spoken to as I went along. And I'll start with someone who is actually an acquaintance when we began, has become a much closer friend through this process, who had lost a son to suicide and had written some poetry about it, but had not spoken about it publicly or indeed really to anyone. And she said, the time is right. And when we sat down, the first thing she said to me was, you asked me to talk about the relationship that I had with Jack. She said, and I'm happy to tell you about that. But I must also tell you about the relationship that I have with Jack. Because in the same way that I carried him inside me when I was pregnant, I carry him inside me now. And she proceeded to talk about the way that that relationship had dawned and about the way that it had grown up. And we engaged in what was then one of my first occasions to do so, with the narrative of guilt that seems to afflict every parent who has lost a child to suicide, no matter what the circumstances were, and no matter how loving the parent was. The sense of culpability is enormous, so enormous that it often impedes research on or understanding of what actually happened. So I was looking at various communities that I wanted to write about, and I had been put in touch with a family who were South Asian immigrants. And when I called the mother to set up our appointment, she said, do you like Indian food? And I said, yes, I do very much. And she said, how do you feel about spicy? And I said, I love spicy food. And she said, North Indian or South Indian? And I thought there is a correct answer to this question, and I don't know what it is. So making a wild guess, I said South Indian. And she said, great. She said, why don't you come? She said, we can talk about the story of my son. She said, if you get here maybe around 10 in the morning, we can talk during the day and I'll make dinner. And I thought this will be a long day of discussion, but I'm happy to hear whatever there may be to say. And what I had begun to find by then is that the simple fact, which all of you heard even in the scientific presentations, that people love their children and those children die, had lost some of its resonance with me. But that in every instance there would be a sudden turning point where the vulnerability of a particular person or family would become entirely manifest. And so I walked into this house in a community that consists almost entirely of immigrants from South Asia, quite a lovely spot, in fact, in New Jersey. And there were pans all over the place, there were piles of dishes, there were incredible smells, there were so many things that were cooking. And I said to the person I had come to see, I said, Shilpa, I said, it was very kind of you to make this enormous feast. The daughter, the sister of the person who had died, had said to me, my mother hasn't cooked like this in years. I said, you didn't have to do that. I really just came to ask you some questions. It's very nice of you, but you didn't have to. And she said, I wanted to make all of Shiv's favorite dishes one last time. And so the poignance continues to surface over and over and over again in the conversation as it comes forward. I wanted also to say that there are many people who are suicidal because they have experienced trauma and abuse of one kind or another. Parents who are creating trauma and who are aware of being abusive do not make themselves available to journalistic interviewers. And so insofar as I've had those stories, they have been from survivors of attempts. And insofar as I have had the stories from families, they've been families who were doing their best. And I want to emphasize, because it relates to something I'll come to later, love is held to be somehow the protection against this kind of loss. Love is a protection in some cases. It is not the adequate protection unto itself, or all of this research would not be necessary. The word love is seldom used in the academic literature because I could say I love the seating arrangement in this room and the view of the bridge, and it's such a vague word. And yet it's the word that I heard most often as I talked to these families who talked about how much they loved their children over and over again. So I did a little bit of work at a hotline that was for LGBTQ youth who are considering suicide. And there was someone who was sitting next to me. And I had noted how high the rate of suicide is among LGBTQ youth, even among those who have achieved great acceptance. But the person next to me got a call, and the person on the other end said, he said, I don't know what to do. And the one who'd answered the call said, well, what is it? And he said, well, I'm 14 and I just came out to my parents. And the other guy said, well, how did they respond? And he said, my father said, this is a Christian household. Your mother and I are going to leave the house now. I'm putting my gun on the kitchen table, and you know what you should do. And I wondered how we had reached a point at which anyone could imagine that that was an appropriate response. And yet, as I talked to other people who had lost children, that young man, so far as we know, not having in fact killed himself, often the response was to remark on the fact that he was still alive, while their much-loved children, in many instances, were not. I've been looking particularly at the question of young people and what the causes are of this escalation in youth suicide. And the cause that is most often in the papers these days, and not without reason, is the advent of the internet and particularly of social media. And yet, the social media aspect of the problem is only one of many aspects. And while the correlation with social media can be pointed out over and over again, we could find, and indeed I have found, but don't have them in front of me, so many correlations that are not, in most likely cases, causalities that have come up over these last 20 years or so. Nonetheless, the correlations are there, and there is damage done without question by social media. And there was one mother I was talking to in Utah who said to me, it took many, many layers of problems for my son to reach the point at which he ended his own life. She said, that was only one of them, and not the most significant one. She said, but if there had been one less, he might very well be alive. And so I think we shouldn't say people used not to feel suicidal and then they signed on for Instagram and suddenly wanted to die, but rather to say that sometimes the content that's put forward by social media sites can exacerbate already existing vulnerabilities and can be, in many ways, the last straw. One father I spoke with, who was in rural Wisconsin, I've been doing a lot of traveling for this project, said, I thought I was such a good father. He said, I took care of my children. He said, I locked the door of our house every night. He said, I didn't know that the lion was already in his bedroom and that I couldn't lock it out. And another person who I spoke with on similar grounds described to me the sense that the advent of social media accounts, which her daughter had kept completely secret, had been the beginning of the breakdown in her own communication with her daughter as her daughter's emphasis turned to other forms of communication. Now, I also want to comment on the question of access and privilege. It was very admirable when John Fetterman was depressed and spoke about it publicly, but the way his depression was treated was that he spent a month at Walter Reed Hospital. The possibility of spending a month in a hospital because you're depressed is available to such a tiny proportion of the American population, and the constant need to find ways to treat children is one that afflicts particularly people who are struggling, who don't have access because they don't have insurance, or they don't have access because of the place where they live. There are areas where there are almost no treatment facilities for children, or they don't have access because they don't have enough experience in education to know how to push for that access, which is part of what's needed in the process. And I, having spent time in failed communist societies, know that it's difficult to establish, perhaps impossible, truly equal cultures. But I have now seen stories that have made me feel as though my own mental health and that of my children is a luxury. And I don't think mental health is a luxury. I think perhaps fancy restaurants and foreign travel are luxuries. I was a young woman I spent time with in Minneapolis. She was a black woman who had grown up under not very privileged circumstances. She was immensely bright. She was deeply emotionally connected. She had a brother who began to develop psychosis, and he made a suicide attempt. He drove into a tree because God had told him to. And then he had a second attempt in which he drove into the plate glass window of a store. And after the second attempt, she was able to persuade him that he was struggling with some kind of mental illness and needed help. And though he had initially resisted that notion, he came with her. And they got to a hospital emergency room, and in the ER there were told, there are no beds in psychiatry right now, but we'll hold him in the emergency room since he's a danger to himself, and we'll move him up to psychiatry as soon as a bed becomes available. He was in the hospital for 8 days, and at the end of 8 days, in the emergency room, never moved up to the psychiatric ward. He was told that his coverage was out and that he no longer had the right to be in a hospital, and he was sent home, and he killed himself 2 weeks later. And when I met her, she was in acute grief and mourning about her brother, who, from what she told me about him, could have been saved. And she herself had sought to find a therapist of color who could understand some of what she'd been through, and had been told there were no therapists of color available to her in Minneapolis. Eventually, we were in fact able to find someone, and she has pulled through. But her brother's life was lost for no good reason, and in calculating the economics of the country, this seems to me not only a humanitarian disaster, but also an economic one, because with treatment, her brother might have been a productive member, most likely would have been, of our society. He too was bright and ambitious and intelligent and in many ways inspiring man. And so we come to this question of social justice. And I recently interviewed a family in Louisiana whose daughter had hanged herself in the exact manner she had seen on a social media post that had been pushed to her. And when I asked her parents whether they felt that race had played a role in what happened, they initially resisted going in that direction because they felt it would be deuniversalizing. But her father finally said, "My ancestors had their bodies broken so that some guy could live in a big plantation house." He said, "Mark Zuckerberg has a compound in Hawaii where he feeds the cows on macadamia nuts," he said, "so that the quality of the meat will be better. And he's built it on the broken body of my daughter." He said, "None of it has changed." So these are the issues that lie outside of the questions of what are the best treatments. What are the best treatments is incredibly important, and the work going on here to find those treatments is crucial. But can we in fact make those treatments available to people who don't happen to have the access that many of us have by virtue of education or even by virtue of location near this hospital of very, very high quality. There are so many things that could be done, and there are so few that are being done, and there is so little interest in American government in trying to curtail this crisis. At a conference I came to here at Columbia, somebody pointed out that people who have a gun in their house are 5 times as likely to lose a child to suicide as people who don't. And that in fact, people who have a gun but also have a gun safe, that risk is cut in half. And that if we were to distribute gun safes, we could immediately lower the rate of youth suicide dramatically in this country, because there are many people who don't know that they would make any difference or who don't have the resources to go and get them, quite apart from questions of guns and the nature of gun rights. There are interventions that can be used in early childhood, especially with disadvantaged populations, that teach them ways of engaging with one another that are often very useful in preventing suicides down the line, as well as preventing a variety of other problems. But most of those programs have to be instituted with young children, and the results are measurable 20 years later. And if you look at a country with a 2 to 4 year election cycle and expect that an intervention that we could use right now that would lower the rate of suicide in 2043 is going to have very much support, then you have little experience of the American system. I spoke this morning with someone whose son, having watched social media about subway surfing, decided to go and give it a try, and who died through subway surfing. And I said to her, "You don't think of it as a suicide?" And she said, "It wasn't a suicide," she said, "but the things he was watching had caused him to become more and more withdrawn. He had become more and more addicted to using his phone." She said, "His life was destroyed by what he was doing, whether we call it a suicide or call it something else." And she has been a fierce, fierce advocate, trying to bring about changes of all kinds in both social media and in the way that subway cars are managed. And when we spoke, she was very poised and she was very fierce in her discourse. And I finally said to her, "I know from the things you've said and from the way you've preserved Zach's room," I said, "I know that you also experience enormous sadness." I said, "But the activism seems to be something you've accomplished through anger." I said, "How do you balance those two things?" And she said, "The only way I can survive is by keeping them separate." She said, "Anger is how I deal with the world, and sadness is what I allow myself at home, because either one of them could overwhelm the other, and I need to be alive to them both." Now, a lot of what I've said so far doesn't sound very hopeful, but I do want to talk about some of the people I've talked to who have survived attempts. In the first place, about the randomness of that survival. One young woman who had taken an overdose of medication, had been determined that her family not know what was happening, had gone upstairs and gone to bed, having had dinner with the family and then done the dishes. And 20 minutes later, her mother called upstairs and said, "You forgot to wash the red pot." And she knew that if she didn't go downstairs, her mother would be coming upstairs to tell her, "Come downstairs and wash that red pot." And as soon as she went downstairs, it was obvious that something was going on because she had taken a significant overdose of medication. And her mother said, "What's happening?" And she confessed to it, was treated, and is now doing tremendously well and a few years behind schedule finishing college. There was one young man I met who had made an attempt and likewise been treated mostly by doing repeated rounds of dialectical behavioral therapy. And I said to him, "What is it that's changed?" Because he seemed quite joyful to me and quite full of life. And he said, "You know, before this happened," he said, "I was just a nihilist. And I thought, life has no meaning, and life has no purpose, and who knows what's going to happen to my generation, and what's the point?" He said, and now I've learned to be an optimistic nihilist. He said, life has no meaning, life has no point, so I might as well have as good a time as I can while I'm here. And I'll end with someone who I saw recently when I was also in Utah. We had first met when I was there in September. He had made a suicide attempt in which he shot himself through the neck, which is usually quite effective, but had somehow missed his windpipe, had missed his carotid artery, and had largely missed his spine. But he had spent 2 months in a hospital and was paralyzed from the neck down and was terribly, terribly, terribly depressed and really struggling. And he had struggled for a long time before that. And I was back in Utah 2 weeks ago, and I saw him again. He's had quite a miraculous degree of physical recovery, unanticipated degrees of physical recovery, and is actually now able in his way to walk, which he had not thought would happen. He had been a mechanic, and he'll never be able to work on cars again because he will not have that fine motor skill. But he also had gone and preached a Christmas Eve sermon. And I said to him, where did all of this energy come from when none of it was there before? And he said, there are two things. He said, one is that I never thought I'd be able to do anything before. He said, if you've watched a toddler's pride when they first managed to go down 2 steps, he said, the toddlers don't remember it. They grow up and those memories are lost. He said, but I'm having those experiences. He said, and if I hadn't survived this attempt, I wouldn't have had a chance to be reborn in that way. And by the way, I should add that I had also asked him, why the neck? I said, why did you shoot yourself through the neck? And he said, I did that because I knew my mother would want to have an open casket. He said, and if I shot myself in the head, she probably wouldn't be able to. And I thought that mix of enormous consideration and the potential to do something that was so destructive was so remarkable, and that mix of that kind of hopefulness, I don't want my mother to be too upset, and the despair that leads someone to kill himself were entwined in such a remarkable way, not only in him, but in many people I've spoken to, and that it was access to that other piece that was at the center. And he said, despite all that, I didn't know how much it would hurt my family for me to do this. He said, but neither did I know how happy they would be that I had survived. He said, and I owe them an apology, he said, and you can't apologize for trying to kill yourself by saying, I'm really sorry, I won't do it again. He said, I can only apologize to them by being happy. He said, they're so happy I'm here, I have to figure out how to be happy about it too. He said, so that's been my project. He said, and it's turned out that it's not as difficult as I thought it was. He said, I wish I'd understood that before. So that's the note of hope on which I'll leave you. Thank you very much.